The Las Vegas Raiders made an interesting change this past week by switching things up with Tyrie Wilson during their game against the Kansas City Chiefs. This change really paid off, and today we'll dive into that. Plus, Antonio Pierce shared his thoughts on Lukey's play calling, which I don't fully agree with, but it's worth discussing. Let's jump right in and start with Tyrie Wilson. As you may know, I wasn't a huge fan of his selection when the Raiders drafted him, especially with players like Jalen Carter and Darnell Wright still available. Wilson was seen more as a project, someone who needed time to develop. Typically, this takes about 2 to 3 years. And now, in his second year, we're finally starting to see some promising signs. In fact, Tyree recorded his first sack of the season against the Chiefs, and it was a big one. Not just a cleanup sack, but a true game-changing moment. He took on the Chiefs' left tackle, W. Morris, and managed to get to the quarterback. This play was arguably the best of his career so far. Throughout the game, we saw several standout moments from Tyree. Usually, he's been somewhat quiet on the field, but against Kansas City, he was actively making plays. I'd argue this was his best game yet. Instead of just locking in with his blocker and not contributing, he was disruptive and impactful. A key change for Tyree was that he played mostly on the inside this time, taking about 70% of his snaps at defensive tackle, particularly in the three technique position. While he can also play other spots, it seems like this role suits him well. Think of players like Leonard Williams and Quinnen Williams. Those are the kinds of roles he was filling. At 6 feet 6 inches and 285 pounds, playing on the inside might just be the best fit for Tyree. That said, he can still make an impact on the edge when needed. But the Raiders might want to consider keeping him inside, especially with Clayton Chasen stepping up and performing well. This shift could allow Tyree to thrive in his new role. Now let's look at some specific moments from the game. Tyree faced off against two of the best guards in the NFL, Trey Smith and Joe Thuney. He had several impressive reps against both, particularly against Smith, where he pushed him back and reset the line of scrimmage during outside zone runs. One notable play showed Tyree not only moving Smith back, but also forcing the running back to cut inside. Even though he didn't make the tackle, this is a crucial play. Coaches will tell you that stopping a zone run effectively means resetting the line and forcing the running back to change direction, which is exactly what Tyree did. Overall, Tyrie Wilson displayed great potential against the Chiefs, and if he can keep this up, he could become a key player for the Raiders. Tyrie Wilson really impressed me with his ability to hold his ground, even against tough opponents like Joe Thuney. At 6 feet 6 inches and 285 pounds, his size and strength are starting to shine through. When he goes up against shorter guys, like those around 6 feet 2 inches or 6 feet 3 inches, it often feels like a mismatch. His height and reach give him an advantage, making it harder for those players to handle him. Even against the Chiefs' left tackle, W. Morris, who stands at 6 feet 4 inches and 6 feet 4.5 inches, Tyree found ways to get to the quarterback. There were several snaps where he was just a heartbeat away from making a big play. Of course, Tyree is still developing and has more to learn, but as Antonio Pierce mentioned in his press conference, the key for him is getting those snaps. The more he plays, the better he'll become. So far this season, he's taken over 200 snaps, and it's clear he's improving. He missed the first 2 weeks, and in his third week, he didn't look fully integrated into the team. But now, you can really see his growth on the field, and I'm excited to see how he continues to develop. Looking ahead, the Raiders need to strategically use Tyree based on matchups. For example, when they face the Cincinnati Bengals, their tackles are huge. Orlando Brown Jr. and Trent Brown are both around 350 pounds. Those matchups might not be ideal for Tyree, so it could be smarter to let someone like Clayton Chasen handle those bigger players since he's faster. However, the Bengals' interior offensive line isn't as strong, and that's where Tyree could shine. If he plays on the inside, he can leverage his size and wingspan to his advantage. The Raiders should keep experimenting with his position, allowing him to grow and learn. I truly believe Tyree has the potential to become a solid player. The progress he's made in the last few weeks gives me hope that by year 3, he'll come back even stronger. Ideally, he could become a key player alongside Max Crosby for the Raiders' future. Now, shifting gears to Antonio Pierce and his thoughts on play calling, particularly regarding Luke Getsy. It's clear to many of us that the Raiders' play calling has been a major hurdle for the team. It's not the defensive line, the offensive line, or even the quarterback that's holding them back. It's the play calling. When Aiden O'Connell stepped in, he faced challenges, and we've seen multiple turnovers with other quarterbacks, highlighting that the system needs improvement. Antonio Pierce acknowledged that the play calling must get better, as there have been missed opportunities. He emphasized that players also need to clean up their penalties and assignments. While Pierce mentioned that Luke
added
will
extra
continue as the
unnecessary
play
pressure
caller,
on him, but I mean,
I believe the
that's the
Bengals
type of
game
guy
might
that
be
we've
a
seen,
crucial turning point.
on different
If
on
things
the
don't
other side
improve,
of.
it could be time for the Raiders to reconsider who's calling the plays. Here's the thing. You don't necessarily have to fire Luke Getsy if he's struggling. Yes, we've seen some issues with his play calling, but it's important to remember that play calling is just one piece of the puzzle. There are also problems with spacing and calling plays that don't fit the situation. For instance, running zone plays in goal line situations doesn't make sense. In one game, Luke called 3 straight zone runs at the 3-yard line, and we ended up getting stopped. That falls on him. If Luke continues to show that he's not effective as a play caller, the Raiders need to consider making a change. They don't even have to fire him outright. They could promote Scott Turner, the passing game coordinator. Turner has experience as a play caller and has seen success in the past. He worked with Sam Howell over the last couple of years, who showed promise under his guidance. If Scott Turner can improve things even a little, it could help the Raiders win games. I'm not suggesting they should aim for wins at the expense of their draft position, but we need to figure out if Antonio Pierce is the right coach. There have been moments when he's mismanaged games, and while we recognize that, we also need to address the frustrating play calling. The Raiders have to determine if they can be successful with good play calling. The worst case scenario is that they find a top-tier play caller next season, but if Antonio Pierce isn't the right coach, it won't matter who the play caller is. If the Raiders start 0-5, changes will need to happen regardless of the offensive strategy. One way to evaluate Antonio Pierce is to consider switching the offensive coordinator. If they transition from Luke Getsy without firing him, he can still contribute to the team while Scott Turner takes over the play calling. However, Antonio Pierce can't keep ignoring the fact that Luke's performance hasn't met expectations. Sure, penalties, like Jackson P. Johnson's 2 false starts last game, are part of the problem, but even with those penalties, we still got to the 4-yard line and couldn't punch it in. We faced similar issues on the next drive when we had the ball at the 3-yard line and couldn't score again. We need to figure out the root causes as we move forward. Now, on to some updates from practice. Center Andre James, who has been a long-term player for the Raiders, didn't practice today due to an injury. Interestingly, this might actually be a blessing in disguise. Last week, Jackson P. Johnson showed some real promise, and I'd argue his performance hinted at top 5 center potential. I want to see him deliver again, especially against a solid defensive line like the Bengals. What's fascinating is that Antonio Pierce mentioned Jackson took 0 snaps at center during OTAs. This is something we've talked about before. When Power Johnson joined the Raiders, he had minimal experience at center, which makes this a great opportunity to see how he performs in a real game situation. Jackson Power Johnson has played both left guard and right guard, but during training camp, he mostly focused on left guard. Interestingly, he had never played center in the NFL before stepping in, yet he performed well. He was able to identify the mic, communicate effectively with his offensive line, and execute the slide calls flawlessly. Out of the 14 snaps he played, excluding spiked plays, he looked impressive. For the Raiders, it might be wise to keep Andre James out for a while to see if Jackson Power Johnson can bring a spark to the team. I genuinely believe that an interior line made up of Dylan Parham, Jordan Meredith, and Jackson Power Johnson could be the best combination this season. Keeping DJ Glaze and Colton Miller at tackle would round out a strong offensive line. Meredith is a smart player, and he and Power Johnson can communicate well. They demonstrated this ability last week, switching on defensive line games seamlessly. Dylan Parham practiced this week, which is good news. He'll likely return to his position, and while Andre James is still a question mark, I would love to see the Raiders stick with Jackson Power Johnson. Even if James can play, I think it's important to see what Johnson can do because he has top 5 potential at center. This season may not lead to a playoff run, but it can help the Raiders identify their strengths and weaknesses. If Jackson Power Johnson can prove himself as a top center, they'll know whether they need to draft guards in the upcoming deep class. The last thing we want is to label Jackson Power Johnson as a guard next season, only to discover Andre James isn't cutting it, and then needing to shift Johnson to center without having drafted a guard. These next several weeks are crucial for figuring this out. If the Raiders can assess their lineup effectively, they could head into the offseason with a solid plan. Imagine drafting a guard in the second or third round to complement Johnson, alongside a combination of Parham, Glaze, or whoever fills the tackle spots. They could build a truly formidable offensive line. I recently watched the Pittsburgh Steelers' offensive line, and it struck me how they're building a physical front. They drafted Darnell Washington, a massive tackle from Georgia, who stands 6 feet 8 inches and weighs 265 pounds. Watching him line up against Max Crosby and hold his own in pass protection was impressive. It's not just Washington. The Steelers have players like Isaac Sumalo and rookie center Broderick Jones, who are tough and physical. They're committed to running over defenders. If the Raiders want to be a bully on the field, something Antonio Pierce emphasizes, they need to invest in those kinds of players. The Steelers are showing how it's done. With players like Najee Harris who can power through anyone, the Raiders need to focus on drafting these types of players. They have some pieces, but they need to figure out what they truly have this season. I hope they keep Jackson Power Johnson in the lineup for a few games to see what he can do. Let me know what you think. If you enjoyed this video, consider subscribing, and I'll catch you next time with another update.